This is Death by Stolen Stallion, a hilarious feel-good cozy mystery, Island Whodunit Book 34. Written by Tess Marlowe and narrated by Sarah.
Hi, Tess Marlowe here. Before Chapter 1 begins, please take 1 second to look at your screen and hit subscribe. It helps me bring you more free cozy mysteries.
Chapter 1. I thought you two died in your sleep. Reg pushed open the creaking wooden gate of Gary's garden, holding a mug of black coffee. Gary and Rafa stood in the center of Gary's porch, looking like they had just survived a localized mud bomb. Gary's yellow tank top was speckled with a dark, oily grit, and a streak of black grease painted a diagonal line across his forehead. Rafa, who usually looked very neat and put together, was currently dripping a combination of brown sludge and calcified water from his elbows. Between them, sitting on Gary's glass table, was the massive stainless steel Fiamma E61 espresso machine they had dragged out of the San Malvino General Hospital attic months ago. It was emitting a high-pitched, menacing hiss. A plume of white steam vented aggressively from a side valve. Gary wiped his protective goggles with the back of a filthy hand. "Why would you think we were dead?" Reg took a slow, deliberate sip from his mug. "Because you two never miss morning coffee on my porch. When 30 minutes went by and neither of you showed up, Alex assumed you were on a new diet, and I assumed Rafa's Cuban past finally caught up with him." Rafa shook his head with a laugh. "I didn't put away as many cartel bosses as you'd think, but thanks for checking on us." "You still won't give up on that biohazard of a coffee machine," Reg said, stepping carefully around a puddle of brown water creeping across the terracotta tiles. "I know you made a hefty donation for it, but just let it go. It's dead, man." "We ordered the parts from Milan this time," Gary said, completely ignoring him. "No more fake mushroom valves. Do you know how hard it is to track down mid-century Italian group head gaskets? I had to use a translation app to bargain with a guy named Giuseppe on eBay." "Do I want to know?" Reg asked, raising an eyebrow. "No, you don't," Rafa sighed, running a hand through his damp, coffee-scented hair. "The Italian parts fit perfectly. The problem is the internal copper boiler. It seems 3 decades of stagnant hospital water and old coffee grounds didn't do it any good." "It's a tragedy," Gary muttered, staring mournfully at the chrome. "I was going to make us authentic cappuccinos this morning. I even bought a latte art pen." "I am perfectly happy with my regular coffee," Reg said, taking another sip to emphasize the point. "At least it doesn't actively try to kill me before 8 in the morning." Before Rafa could launch into a defense of dual boiler extraction methods, a polite, incredibly strained throat clearing sounded from the garden gate. A man stood just outside the gate. He looked like he had been surgically removed from a luxury lifestyle magazine. He wore a moisture-wicking equestrian polo in a crisp navy blue, pristine beige riding breeches, and tall leather paddock boots that had never once touched actual mud. His skin was perfectly tanned, but his face was currently pale and slick with an anxious sweat. He stared at Gary and Rafa with a mixture of absolute horror and deep regret. "Excuse me?" the man said, his voice tight. "I am looking for Rafael Cardenas, the private investigator." Gary instantly perked up, dropping the heavy brass wrench onto the table with a loud clatter. "A client! Rafa, look, the pink flyers are still working." Rafa straightened, instantly restoring a fraction of his usual respectful demeanor, entirely ignoring the fact that his t-shirt was practically see-through with coffee water. "I am Cardenas. How can I help you?" The man's eyes darted from Rafa's ruined t-shirt to Gary's grease-stained forehead, and finally to Reg, who was casually leaning against the stucco wall with his coffee. I was hoping for a private consultation," the man hesitated, taking a half-step back toward the street. "This is a matter of extreme delicacy. My employers require total discretion. I really shouldn't discuss this in front of—" He waved a manicured hand vaguely at Gary and Reg. "The maintenance staff." Reg let out a short, quiet laugh into his mug. "These men are my trusted associates," Rafa said, his tone dropping into the smooth, ice-cold register he usually reserved for interrogation rooms. "If you have a problem, you are free to speak to all of us. If you want privacy, I suggest you go find a confessional." "Pretentious bird!" The man jumped nearly a foot in the air. Polly dropped from the low-hanging branch of a bougainvillea bush and landed heavily on Gary's shoulder, ruffled his bright feathers, and shamelessly glared directly at the stranger. "Horse apples, bad apples." The man swallowed hard, pulling a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket to dab the sweat from his temples. The arrogance was melting fast, replaced by a deep, frantic panic. "My name is Harrison Croft," he started, keeping his voice to a hushed, urgent whisper. "I am the general manager of the Vista Verde Equestrian Estate on the North Ridge." "Fancy," Reg commented. "Isn't that the gated estate with the climate-controlled stables, where the horses live better than most of the residents on this island?" "They are elite athletes," Croft snapped, a brief flash of defensive pride breaking through his panic. "And as of this morning, my most valuable athlete is missing." Rafa crossed his arms, mindful of the wet fabric sticking to his chest. "You lost a horse." "I did not lose him," Croft hissed, gripping the wrought iron bars of the gate. "Midnight Sonata is a Hanoverian warm-blood stallion. He is a champion showjumper. He is worth $1.2 million. He was in his stall when I did night checks at 11, and when the grooms arrived at 5 this morning, the stall door was unlatched and he was gone." "Did you check the perimeter?" Reg asked, shifting into operational mode. "Gates left open? Fences down?" "The main gate was locked," Croft said, rubbing his temples. "The fencing is electrified and intact, but there is a service trail at the back of the property that leads directly into the High Ridge Hills. The ground was disturbed. Someone took him. If someone stole $1 million asset from a secured facility, why are you here?" Rafa asked, tilting his head slightly. "Why didn't you call the San Malvino Police Department?" Croft let out a derisive scoff. "The local police? Absolutely not. No offense to your local law enforcement, but they wouldn't know the difference between a Hanoverian warm blood and a beach donkey. They would come in with sirens, string up yellow tape, and treat my estate like a common crime scene." "That is generally how crimes are handled, yes," Rafa noted deadpan. "You don't understand," Croft pleaded, stepping fully onto the patio and closing the gate behind him. "If the police get involved, the press gets involved. If the press gets involved, the owner finds out." Gary squinted, wiping another smear of grease across his cheek. "The guy who owns the horse doesn't know it's missing?" "Mr. Hedberg is currently on his yacht off the coast of Monaco," Croft explained, pulling a thick, heavy envelope from the back pocket of his breeches. "He is a severe micromanager. He had high-definition cameras installed in every stall. Every morning when he wakes up, he logs into the app on his iPad to check on the horses." Reg checked his watch. "Monaco is 6 hours ahead of us. If it's 8 in the morning here, it's 2 in the afternoon there." "I looped the feed for a while," Croft said frantically, tapping the face of his own expensive smartwatch. "But I can't do it forever. He will notice. If by tonight Midnight Sonata is not standing in his stall, eating his imported Timothy hay, I am a dead man." Croft slammed the thick manila envelope onto the glass table, narrowly missing a puddle of spilled espresso. The flap popped open, revealing thick stacks of crisp $100 bills. "This is double your daily rate plus a premium for extreme discretion," Croft said, breathing heavily. "I need you to find the stallion and quietly lead him back to the estate before Mr. Hedberg's alarm goes off in Monaco." Gary stared at the money. Polly squawked and lunged for a $100 bill, but Gary managed to gently block his beak with his hand. Rafa looked at the envelope, then looked up at the rugged, heavily forested hills rising in the distance behind the Isla Lirio compound. He reached out and pulled the envelope across the glass table. "Mr. Croft," Rafa said smoothly, offering a charming, razor-sharp smile. "You have come to the right place. We will find your stallion." Chapter 2. "All right, we need answers," Shannon announced, walking up the gravel path. Who was the guy practically sweating through his designer polo? He walked past Alex's porch looking like he just watched a ghost steal his wallet. "That was Harrison Croft," Rafa said, aggressively scrubbing the last remnants of calcified espresso sludge from his forearms. "The general manager of the Vista Verde Equestrian Estate up on the North Ridge." We have an equestrian estate on the North Ridge? Alex raised an eyebrow. I thought it was just cell towers and that one guy who sells illegal fireworks out of a shipping container. There is an entire luxury farm hidden behind the tree line, Reg supplied, leaning against the wall. Climate-controlled barns, imported hay, the works. I read about it in a magazine at my mechanic's. Billionaires use it to stable their showjumpers. Croft just hired us to find a missing Hanoverian warm-blood stallion. It's worth $1.2 million. Shannon stopped chewing on her iced coffee straw. $1 million horse? On San Malvino? How do you even get a horse like that onto the island? Do they fly them in? Do they put them on the public ferry? Do horses get seasick? They probably charter private transport barges, Reg said, taking another sip of his coffee. And yes, animals can have motion sickness, but even a seasick stallion probably handles the choppy water better than Lucian. Shannon snorted, nearly choking on a piece of ice. Hey, leave Lucien alone. He bought those acupressure wristbands. They almost worked last time we went on Val's boat to fix some cables. He only threw up twice. The front door to Gary's apartment banged open. Gary stepped out onto the patio. He had abandoned his grease-stained tank top. In its place, he wore a stiff, pearl-snap denim shirt tucked into extremely tight jeans, accessorized with a massive silver belt buckle shaped like a horseshoe. He topped the entire look off with a beige, wide-brimmed Stetson hat that looked like it belonged in a budget spaghetti western. "How are we feeling about the pearl snaps?" Gary asked, doing a slow spin. "I want the horse to know I respect its culture." Alex closed her eyes and let out a long, patient breath. "Gary, sweetie, it looks more like Reggie's culture, and isn't it a bit hot today for that ensemble?" "It blocks the sun," Gary protested, adjusting the brim. "We're going into the rugged wilderness of the North Ridge. I need protection from the elements." "You'll need protection from Val if you end up in the hospital with a heat stroke," Reg pointed out. "And I never owned that kind of ridiculous shirt." Gary frowned, spun on his heel, and disappeared back inside his apartment, slamming the door. "Can Bombay track a horse?" Rafa turned off the garden hose and dried his arms with a relatively clean towel. "He spent his prime sniffing out buried C4 and nitrate compounds in combat zones," Reg said, smiling. "But he tracked all kinds of weird stuff in the last year, so a 1,200-pound sweaty animal shouldn't be a problem." The front door banged open again. Gary reappeared. He had kept the pearl snap shirt but added a leather vest completely covered in 6-inch fringe. He held up a coiled lasso. "Absolutely not," Rafa deadpanned. "The fringe breaks up my silhouette," Gary argued, shaking his shoulders to make the leather strips dance. "It's basic camouflage. What if the horse is easily spooked?" "If the horse sees you wearing that, it will jump off a cliff," Reg promised. "Go put on normal hiking boots and something breathable, and leave Polly at home. I'm not looking for a macaw in the jungle if he decides to fly off." The drive up the winding mountain roads to the North Ridge felt like crossing into a completely different country. The chaotic, colorful, rum-soaked energy of downtown San Malvino faded away, replaced by iron gates, towering limestone walls, and security cameras mounted on every available surface. Reg parked his Jeep near the rear fence of the Vista Verde equestrian estate. Beyond the heavy iron service gate, 3 massive, pristine white barns stood in a neat row. Harrison Croft stood on the inside of the gate, nervously checking his watch. "You made good time," he said through the bars of the gate. "We aim to please," Rafa said, stepping up to the wrought iron. He casually slid his aviators down the bridge of his nose, taking a slow, calculating look at the pristine barns. "I would like to examine the stall. If the lock was picked or forced, it will tell us what kind of thief we are dealing with." Harrison crossed his arms, his posture stiffening. "That won't be possible. The stall has already been cleaned by the morning staff. And frankly, the owners of the other horses boarded here pay a premium for absolute privacy and security. They would not appreciate random excursions into the barn." His eyes flicked disdainfully to Gary's cowboy hat, then down to Bombay, who was currently sniffing a patch of weeds with enthusiasm. Rafa's jaw tightened. "You hired us to do a job, Mr. Croft." We can't do the job if you block off the crime scene. The crime scene is out there, Harrison said, pointing a finger toward the rugged, overgrown service trail snaking up into the hills behind the estate. I sent some grooms to follow the hoof prints, but they lost the trail. If someone knew the layout of the property, the patrol schedules, and exactly which horse to take, it suggests premeditation, Alex said calmly. Do you have any disgruntled employees? Anyone who was recently fired? Harrison scoffed, adjusting the collar of his polo. My staff is thoroughly vetted. No one here would risk their career for a stunt like this. He leaned closer to the bars, lowering his voice conspiratorially. If you want my professional opinion, you should look at the gypsy farm on the other side of the ridge. Alex's warm expression vanished instantly. I think you mean the Roma farm, she said sternly. Roma, gypsies, whatever, Croft said, completely missing the shift in the atmosphere. They run a dilapidated little breeding operation a few miles east. They've been trying to buy property closer to my estate for years, but the zoning board keeps shutting them out. I bet one of them sneaked over here in the middle of the night. Stealing horses is their thing. They are Roma people, Mr. Croft, Rafa said. Not gypsies. And attributing a highly coordinated million-dollar theft to an ethnic stereotype is kind of lazy, don't you think? Harrison blinked, clearly taken aback by the reprimand. Look, whatever you want to call them, they need money, and Midnight Sonata is worth a fortune. It's basic math. Rafa rolled his eyes and shook his head in disbelief. Just bring us a scent article, something the horse wore, unwashed. Chapter 3. The transition from the manicured luxury of the Vista Verde equestrian estate to the untamed wilderness of the North Ridge took exactly 4 minutes, and Gary was already regretting every single life choice that led him here. The service trail was less of a trail and more of a vertical, muddy trench carved through dense, sweltering jungle. The mid-morning sun baked the moisture trapped in the canopy, turning the air into a suffocating, breathable soup. Gary swatted a massive mosquito off his neck, loudly cursing his wardrobe. The wide-brimmed Stetson hat was currently trapping a small oven of body heat against his skull, and his tight, pearl-snap denim shirt clung to his back like a wet second skin. A few paces ahead, Reg followed Bombay, who glued his nose to the dirt and pulled his dad deeper into the tree line. Shannon used a sturdy palm frond to push a spider web out of her path. She was entirely out of breath, her paint-splattered overalls offering zero ventilation. So, she panted, looking over her shoulder at Rafa and Alex. The Roma farm Croft was complaining about. I thought Romani people were mostly a European demographic. How did they end up running a farm on a Caribbean island? Migration, Shannon, Rafa said, stepping over a mossy log. They are originally from northern India. Over centuries, they migrated through the Middle East into the Balkans and eventually spread across Europe and the Americas. My grandmother used to hire a Romani family for renovations when I was a boy. They were exceptional metal workers. Reg suddenly held up a closed fist. The group froze. Reg crouched, pointing to a deep, crescent-shaped indentation in the mud near the root of a palm tree. Hoof print, Reg murmured, tracing the edge of the track with 2 fingers. Deep toe dig. The horse was spooked here, moving at a full canter. Someone was dragging him up this ridge in a hurry. Reg gave Bombay a short whistle, and the dog immediately dropped his nose back into the brush, pulling them forward again. Gary scrambled over the log Rafa had just cleared, nearly losing his cowboy hat in a low-hanging branch. Okay, so if they're from India and Europe, why did Croft call them gypsies? I know it's a bad word, and Alex practically vaporized him with her eyes, but where does the word actually come from? Alex offered Gary a warm, patient smile, easily matching Reg's brisk pace up the incline. It's an exonym, Gary, Alex explained, ducking under a cluster of broad fern leaves. That means it's a name given to them by outsiders, not what they call themselves. When Romani people first arrived in Western Europe centuries ago, the locals mistakenly believed they came from Egypt. Over time, Egyptian was corrupted into gypsy. So it's like Columbus calling Native Americans Indians, just because he sailed the wrong way? Gary asked, wiping a streak of sweat from his forehead. Something like that, Alex nodded. Over the centuries, the word evolved into a heavy slur. It was used to stereotype them as thieves, scammers, or untrustworthy drifters. Think about the phrase, getting gypped. Gary blinked, his boots slipping slightly on the slick mud. Oh, man, I never even put that together. That's awful. It is, Alex agreed. Croft is relying on a centuries-old racist trope just because he didn't want to admit his own security system failed. Shannon grabbed a low branch to pull herself up a particularly steep section of the trail. But wait, aren't Romani people nomads? How do they own a horse farm just down the ridge? Don't nomads travel? Not all of them travel, Shannon, Rafa said, pushing another branch away. That is another misconception. Historically, a lot of that nomadic lifestyle was forced upon them. European towns passed exclusionary laws, refusing to let them buy land or settle within city limits. They had to keep moving to survive. Fascinating, Reg muttered, keeping his eyes locked on Bombay. But tone down your history lesson a bit. We don't know who's waiting for us on the other side of the jungle. Alex nodded, stepping up beside Rafa. Today, many Romani people are completely settled. They own homes, they build communities, and they run highly successful businesses, just like any other marginalized group. But because their ancestors were forced to be on the move for so long, they became masters of portable trades. Like what? Gary asked, finally taking off the Stetson and using it to fan his flushed face. Like music, antique trading, metalworking, Rafa listed, his eyes scanning the dense foliage ahead. And most notably horses. They are historically some of the finest horse breeders and trainers in the world, so a Roma family running an equine facility on San Malvino makes perfect logical sense. Right, Gary concluded, nodding along. So Croft is just a prejudiced jerk who lost his boss's horse and wanted an easy scapegoat. Precisely, Rafa smiled. Up ahead, Bombay suddenly stopped. The heavy, rhythmic panting of the dog vanished. Bombay's entire posture shifted from the eager, forward-leaning pull of a tracking dog into rigid, absolute stillness. The thick fur along his spine stood straight up. A low, vibrating growl rumbled deep in his chest. Hold, Reg said quietly, throwing a hand back toward the group. Gary froze mid-step, his boot hovering awkwardly over a root. Shannon held her breath, gripping the strap of her paint-splattered overalls. The dense, suffocating wall of jungle suddenly broke open. They had reached the peak of the North Ridge. The tree line parted to reveal a massive, hidden clearing, carpeted in tall, vibrant green wildgrass. The sun broke through the canopy here, bathing the secluded meadow in brilliant, dappled light. Standing dead in the center of the clearing was Midnight Sonata. The Hanoverian warmblood was breathtaking. He stood nearly 17 hands high. Entirely pitch black, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the sunlight. A heavy leather halter hung loosely around his massive head, the lead rope trailing in the dirt. "Oh, wow!" Shannon gasped. "I've never seen such a beautiful horse." The horse was peacefully grazing on a patch of wildflowers, completely unfazed by the sudden appearance of 5 humans and a dog. Gary let out a massive, echoing sigh of relief, slapping his Stetson against his thigh. Oh, thank God. Easiest money ever made. Now you can buy all the fancy espresso machines you want, Rafa. I'm gonna go pet that pretty boy. He took a joyful step forward into the clearing. Reggie's arm shot out, grabbing a fistful of Gary's pearl-snap shirt and violently yanking him backward into the tree line. "Hey!" Gary yelped, stumbling into Rafa. "What gives?" "Look at the grass, Gary," Reg said, his voice entirely devoid of humor. Gary squinted, following Reg's gaze. The tall wild grass near the stallion's front hooves was flattened. Lying on his back in the dirt was a young man in dark jeans and a black t-shirt. His arms were splayed awkwardly at his sides, and his eyes stared blankly up at the tropical canopy. A dark, jagged pool of crimson had soaked into the collar of his shirt, matting his hair to the grass. Midnight Sonata took a slow, casual step forward, his iron-shod hoof landing mere inches from the dead man's outstretched hand, and went back to chewing a mouthful of wildflowers. The wind rustled through the clearing. The silence was absolute. "Well," Rafa murmured, his eyes locking onto the corpse. I suppose that explains why the horse stopped running. Alex let out a slow, steady breath. Time to call Angela. Chapter 4. Did you fix your precious coffee machine and want to invite me for a celebratory cappuccino? Mendoza's voice crackled through the speaker of Rafa's cell phone, carrying the distinct, echoing background noise of the San Malvino police station bullpen. Rafa stood near the edge of the clearing, keeping his voice low so as not to spook the massive $1 million stallion grazing a few feet away. I am afraid not, Angie, Rafa said, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple, his eyes locked on the lifeless body half buried in the wild grass. The FIMA E61 remains a tragic casualty of calcification, but more importantly, you need to bring a crime scene unit up to the North Ridge. The background noise on the other end of the line instantly muted as Mendoza likely closed her office door. The North Ridge? Rafa, that's just cell towers and billionaire horse stables. What did Gary do now? For once, Gary is completely innocent, Rafa replied, watching Gary aggressively fan his flushed face with his wide-brimmed Stetson hat. The manager of the Vista Verde estate hired us to track a stolen Hanoverian warm blood. We just found the horse. We also found a dead body keeping it company. A long, heavy sigh hissed through the phone speaker. A body in the woods. Let me guess. No paved vehicle access? Nope. Rafa looked back down the steep, muddy trench of a service trail they had just climbed. It is a very rigorous hike. Mendoza let out a sigh, already sounding exhausted. Crane is going to hate that. 30 minutes later, the dense, sweltering silence of the jungle was shattered by the sound of furious cursing. I am a man of science, Angela. I am not a Sherpa. I require linoleum floors and industrial air conditioning to function at my peak. Dr. Elliot Crane burst through the wall of ferns at the edge of the clearing, his scrubs plastered to his chest with sweat, and a stray palm frond stuck to his right pant leg. Behind him, 2 uniformed crime scene technicians were violently struggling to drag a collapsed metal gurney over a massive tree root. Mendoza stepped into the clearing right behind Crane, looking mildly flushed and annoyed. Keep moving, Elliot. The body isn't going to autopsy itself. If someone gets murdered outside the city limits one more time, I am putting in my resignation papers, Crane threatened, aggressively peeling the palm frond off his pants. I mean it this time. I will walk away. Mendoza ducked under a low-hanging vine, her eyes immediately scanning the scene. What are you going to do? Open a private mortuary? Crane paused, genuinely considering the logistics of the threat for a second. No. You're right. I can't stand dealing with grieving relatives. Lucien stumbled into the clearing last, looking like he had just survived a shipwreck. He was clutching his tablet to his chest, like a life preserver, his dark curls plastered to his forehead. He took one look at the sheer wall of green foliage surrounding them and let out a miserable groan. I hate nature, he announced to no one in particular. There's no Wi-Fi. There are too many bugs, and now there's a giant, terrifying monster. And he pointed a finger toward the center of the clearing. Midnight Sonata had barely moved. The massive black stallion was idly chewing a mouthful of wildflowers, his dark eyes passively watching the police invasion. It's just a horsey, Lucien, Shannon said softly. Look how pretty he is. It's basically a dinosaur, Lucien said, pressing his back firmly against a tree trunk, keeping maximum distance between himself and the animal. Look at the size of its hooves. Why is it just standing there? If a murder happened right next to it, shouldn't it have galloped away? They're flight animals. He couldn't, Reg said, kneeling near the victim's outstretched arm, pointing down at the man's wrist. The heavy braided cotton lead rope attached to the stallion's leather halter didn't just fall to the grass. It was wrapped tightly, twice over, around the dead man's right forearm. Mendoza snapped on a pair of blue latex gloves and carefully stepped closer, mindful of where she put her feet. He tied himself to the horse? He wrapped the lead rope around his hand, Alex said, her brow furrowed. I think he didn't want to lose the grip on the animal. Or he was in a massive hurry and didn't know what he was doing, Gary suggested, finally placing his Stetson back on his head. Look, maybe it wasn't a murder. Maybe he was trying to steal the horse in the dark. He tripped over a root, the horse pulled the rope tight, and he fell and hit his head on a rock. Accidental death. Case closed. We still get our money, right? Your optimism is as exhausting as this hike, Gary, Crane muttered, gently placing his hands on either side of the victim's skull. Massive depressed skull fracture to the occipital bone. Significant localized hemorrhaging. He certainly did not trip and fall on a rock. Gary crossed his arms. How can you be so sure? It's dark up here at night. Roots are slippery. Crane sighed, pointing a purple-gloved finger at the victim's right hand, specifically avoiding the coiled lead rope. Look at the fingers. The knuckles are severely bruised. The skin is split over the index and middle finger, and there is fresh, dried blood under the fingernails. Now look at his face. Mendoza leaned in closer. The left side of the victim's face, right over the cheekbone, was heavily swollen, a deep, angry purple bruise blossoming under the skin. His lower lip was split. Defensive wounds, Mendoza said quietly. Offensive and defensive, Crane corrected. He took a very hard punch to the face, and he threw at least one very solid right hook of his own. He was in a violent, close-quarters fistfight right before someone bypassed his guard and caved his skull in with a heavy object. Which means someone else was definitely here, Rafa murmured, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the tall grass. And they didn't leave on foot, Reg added, pointing down at the muddy earth just beyond the tree line. 2 horses came up into this clearing. The tracks overlap here, cutting deep into the soil. They were side by side. Only one set of tracks leaves. Mendoza followed Reggie's gaze, her expression hardening. So, 2 people ride up to this clearing in the middle of the night. One of them is dragging a stolen $1 million stallion. They get into a fistfight. The thief gets his skull bashed in. The killer gets back on their horse and rides away, leaving the stallion and the body behind. She patted down the dead man's dark jeans until she felt the distinct, rigid square of a wallet in his back pocket and carefully extracted it, flipping open the worn brown leather. A standard San Malvino driver's license sat behind the clear plastic window. Nico Lavari. Mendoza read the name aloud. Lucian, run him. Lucian jumped, nearly dropping his tablet. Right, running. Okay, give me a second. The satellite uplink is crawling out here. His fingers flew across the screen as he kept one eye fixed on Midnight Sonata. The horse let out a loud, sudden snort, tossing its massive head. Lucien flinched so hard he bumped into a tree. It's aggressive, Lucien yelped. It's asserting dominance. It's clearing a fly out of its nose. Shannon patted Lucien's shoulder soothingly. Keep typing, sweetie. The horse isn't going to eat you. Got him, Lucien said, turning the screen to the group. Nico Lavari, 32 years old, born and raised on San Malvino. No criminal record, not even a speeding ticket. He pays his taxes on time, and his credit score is frankly offensive. Employment history? Mendoza prompted. Lucien tapped another window on his screen. He's registered as the vice president and co-founder of an LLC, Ironwood Equine. The business license lists a sprawling property address exactly 4 miles east of this ridge. Alex stepped forward, her hands tucked into the pockets of her linen trousers. 4 miles east. That must be the Roma horse farm Croft was complaining about. Gary stared at the body, his jaw dropping slightly. Wait, so Croft was actually right? The Roma farm really did steal the horse? Let's not jump to conclusions, Rafa said. We don't know anything yet. A dead vice president, a $1 million witness that can't talk, and a killer riding off into the hills, Mendoza summarized, her eyes locking onto the eastern tree line where the second set of tracks disappeared into the shadows. She turned to Lucien, pointing a latex-covered finger at his tablet. Send the address for Ironwood Equine to my phone. Leave 2 uniforms here to help Crane bag the body and call animal control to fetch the horse. I am not touching that dinosaur, Lucien muttered defensively. Chapter 5 The drive from the rugged, silent peak of the North Ridge to the sprawling valley below took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like arriving on a different planet. Ironwood Equine LLC was not the dilapidated little operation Harrison Croft had described. It was a massive, vibrant, and stunningly beautiful estate. Where Vista Verde had felt sterile, clinical, and eerily quiet, Ironwood was bursting with life. A long, sweeping driveway lined with ancient, moss-draped oak trees led to a series of pristine, dark wood barns with open, breezy aisles. In the sprawling green pastures beyond, dozens of sleek, athletic horses grazed in the late morning sun. "Well," Gary said, leaning out the back window of Reg's Jeep, "Croft is a massive liar. This place is at least twice the size of his sci-fi barn and looks way more fun." The front lawns of the massive Spanish colonial main house were swarming with people. A small army of caterers, florists, and family members were buzzing across the manicured grass. 3 massive white canvas party tents were being erected near the edge of the property. The smell of roasting meats, garlic, and sweet plantains cut through the humid air. "Oh no," Alex said, her gaze locked onto a pair of florists wrestling a massive archway made of white roses, baby's breath, and trailing silk ribbons. "What is it, honey?" Reg asked. "I think it's not just a random party," Alex said, pointing toward the white floral archway and a stack of delicate gold-rimmed chairs being unloaded from a box truck. "Those are wedding tents." "I don't believe in bad omens," Rafa said with a sigh. "But a murder on a wedding day feels like one of them." "Delivering the news is not going to be easy," Mendoza said, weaving through a group of men carrying a massive stack of sound equipment. She intercepted a teenager in a crisp white button-down shirt who was carefully balancing a crate of expensive champagne on his hip. "Excuse me," she said, flashing her shield. "I need to speak to a member of the Lavari family. It is urgent." The teenager laughed, readjusting the heavy crate. "You're gonna have to be more specific, officer. Half the people on this lawn are Lavaris, the other half are trying to marry one. What's the problem? Did the permit for the fireworks not clear?" "I need to speak to whoever is in charge," Mendoza said, her tone leaving absolutely no room for misinterpretation. The kid's smile faltered. He looked at the badge one more time. "Right. Let me get the boss." He set the crate down on the grass and jogged toward the main house. A few minutes later, a man in his late 50s with thick, silver-streaked dark hair in a jewel-toned sapphire blue suit walked toward them. "I am Stefan Lavari," he said, extending a hand to Mendoza. "How can I help you? If it is the noise ordinances, I assure you, we have paid all the island fees for the reception." "Mr. Lavari, I am Detective Angela Mendoza," Mendoza said, shaking his hand. "Is there somewhere we can speak privately?" "Of course." Stefan's polite smile vanished. "Inside." He turned on his heel and led them through the heavy oak doors, down a wide arched hallway, and into his private office. The room was a stunning testament to the Lavari family's heritage and success. The walls were paneled in rich, dark mahogany, lined with glass front cabinets holding dozens of silver and brass equestrian trophies, gleaming in the sunlight filtering through the shutters. "Tell me," Stefan said, walking behind his massive wooden desk but refusing to sit down. "Mr. Lavari," Mendoza said, collecting herself, "about an hour ago my team responded to a scene up on the North Ridge service trail. A young man was found deceased. We recovered his wallet from the scene. The ID belonged to a Nico Lavari." Stefan's breath hitched. "No," he whispered, collapsing into his chair. No, he is getting dressed. He is with his cousins." "Mr. Lavari, I am so deeply sorry," Mendoza said, looking at the man. "Today is his wedding," Stefan choked out, tears instantly spilling over his dark eyelashes and tracking down his weathered cheeks. 400 people are outside." "I am so sorry to bring this to your door today," Mendoza said softly, "but I need to ask you a few questions so we can find out exactly what happened." Stefan dragged a trembling hand down his face, wiping the tears, and looked up at Mendoza. How did he die? Stefan asked. Was it a car? Did he crash on the mountain road? No, sir, Mendoza said quietly. It wasn't a car accident. He was found in a clearing on the high ridge. He died from blunt force trauma to the back of the head, and he wasn't alone. Stefan's brow furrowed in confusion. Not alone? Who was he with? He was holding a horse, Rafa said, stepping forward. A Hanoverian warm-blood stallion, pitch black. The horse belonged to the Vista Verde estate. The confusion on Stefan's face vanished. He closed his eyes, his head dropping forward until his chin touched his chest. I told him, Stefan whispered. I told him not to do it. I told him to let it go. Told him not to do what, Mr. Lavari? Mendoza asked. Stefan took a ragged, shuddering breath, staring at the grain of his desk. Croft, Harrison Croft and his bosses. They have been trying to zone us out of this valley for as long as I can remember. They hate us. They call us dirty. They call us thieves. I have ignored it. Small, prejudiced people. I told Nico to let our success be the only answer we give them. But Nico wouldn't let go, Alex asked softly. He was furious since he was a teenager, Stefan said, looking up at Alex. But last week was the final straw. What happened last week, Mr. Lavari? Rafa asked. Last week at the Island Zoning Board, Croft made a comment. He implied that the only way a Lavari could get $1 million horse was to steal it in the dark. He called us a bunch of gypsy horse thieves to the entire council, Stefan said, and Nico decided to live up to the name. What do you mean? Mendoza asked. There is an old tradition in our culture, Stefan explained, his voice shaking. In the old times, a groom would steal a prized horse on the eve of his wedding to present to his bride, to prove his bravery, to prove his prowess. No one does it anymore. It's just part of our lore. But Nico decided to revive it, Rafa finished for him, piecing the puzzle together. He wanted to humiliate Croft, take his most prized possession for a joyride and return it with a funny note from the horse thieves, Stefan sobbed, burying his face in his hands. It was a prank, a stupid, arrogant prank born out of pride. I told him to leave it alone. Did he plan to do it alone? Mendoza asked. Stefan suddenly stopped crying. Someone from Vista Verde must have caught him and killed him for it. He walked slowly around the desk, stopping mere inches from Mendoza. You find the man who killed my boy on his wedding day, detective, because if you don't get justice for my son, I will. Chapter 6. The walk back to the cars was quiet. Mendoza stopped at the bumper of her cruiser and stared back at the sprawling Ironwood estate. Well, Gary muttered, tossing his Stetson into the back of Reg's Jeep. I officially hate Harrison Croft. Not only is he a prejudiced snob, but he's a murderer. We don't know that Croft is the killer, Gary, Alex said, offering a bottle of water to Shannon, who looked entirely heartbroken by the wedding preparations. Stefan Lavari is a grieving father looking for a target. It makes sense that he would blame the man who insulted his family, but we have to look at the motives. Rafa leaned against the passenger door of the Jeep, pulling his aviators from his pocket. Alex is right. Look at Croft's behavior this morning on the patio. He was terrified. He was sweating through his clothes. If he or one of his security guards had beaten a man to death in the woods last night, why would he come to my apartment at 8 a.m. and offer me double pay to find the horse? To control the narrative, Reg said, crossing his arms. It's a classic cover-up strategy. You hire a third party to discover the crime scene. That way, when the police show up, you get to play the shocked, innocent victim who was just trying to recover stolen property. Mendoza shook her head. No, I don't buy it. If Croft knew there was a dead body next to that stallion, he wouldn't have hired a random PI to find it. He would have sent his own people to quietly bury Nico Lavari in the woods, load the horse into a trailer, and pretend the whole thing never happened. Croft's panic was about losing his job, not hiding a homicide. Which means whoever killed Nico didn't tell Croft about it, Shannon concluded, leaning against the Jeep. Maybe a security guard caught Nico stealing the horse, things got out of hand, and the guard panicked and ran. It's possible, Mendoza conceded, her eyes narrowing as she worked through the logistics. But we are missing a massive piece of the puzzle. How did Nico get the horse out in the first place? Rafa slid his sunglasses onto his face. Vista Verde is a fortress, electrified fences, high-definition cameras on every stall, keypad entry on the barn doors. Exactly, Mendoza nodded, pushing off the cruiser. Even if Nico was a master horseman and knew how to handle the animal, no amount of equestrian skill would help him to bypass a digital security system. You can't just walk onto a billionaire's estate in the middle of the night, pick a padlock, and stroll out with a 1,200-pound animal without triggering an alarm. Reg pulled his keys from his pocket, the metal jingling sharply. Someone let him in. An inside job, Gary gasped, pointing a finger at the sky. Someone on Croft's payroll gave Nico access, Mendoza agreed, pulling her own keys from her blazer. Someone disabled the alarms, unlocked the stall, and handed Nico the lead rope, and maybe that same someone followed him up the service trail when the plan went wrong. Mendoza took out her phone and dialed. Lucien, are you still on the ridge? Yes, boss. Lucien's voice crackled through the speaker. Animal Control finally got here. They're leading Midnight Sonata away. Not a dinosaur anymore, huh? Shannon asked with a smile. He was so quiet all the time, just minding his business. He really grew on me, and Bombay likes him too. I'm happy for everyone involved, but I got a job for you, Mendoza cut him off. Get Tito. Tell him I want a marked squad car or two at the front gates of Vista Verde in 10 minutes, with the light bars on. Go make some noise. The quiet luxury atmosphere of the Vista Verde equestrian estate was completely obliterated by the flashing red and blue lights of San Malvino police cruisers. Officer Tito had parked his marked vehicle horizontally across the pristine limestone driveway, effectively blocking the heavy iron main gates. Just to be thorough, Tito and Lucien were wrapping a massive spool of yellow crime scene tape around the keypad pedestal. Harrison Croft was having a complete, spectacular meltdown. "You can't do this!" Croft shrieked through the iron bars, his voice cracking violently as Mendoza stepped out of her car. "You have to turn those lights off! Take that tape down! Are you insane?" Mendoza ignored him entirely. She walked up to the gate and held up her badge. "Open the gate, Mr. Croft." "No!" Croft stammered, backing away from the bars. He pointed a shaking finger at Rafa. "I hired you. I paid you for absolute discretion. Why did you bring the entire police department to my driveway? Bunch of amateurs." "Because your horse was found next to a dead body, Mr. Croft," Rafa said, walking up to the gate. "Discretion is no longer on the menu." Croft's eyes went wide. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his spray-on tan looking sallow and sickly. A dead body?" "Nico Lavari," Reg said, looking straight at him. "From the Ironwood estate. You know the name, don't you?" Croft staggered back a step, genuinely horrified. His mouth opened and closed twice before he managed to form a word. The Roma farm? One of them is dead? On my trail?" "Open the gate," Mendoza repeated, her tone dropping an octave. "This is now an active homicide investigation. You are going to give me a full list of your security personnel, a timeline of your patrols, and unfettered access to the barn where Midnight Sonata was kept." Croft shook his head violently. "I can't let you in the barn," Croft pleaded, his voice reaching a fever pitch. "If any of the horse owners see San Malvino police officers striding through my facility, I am ruined. No one will board their horses with me anymore. And where is Midnight Sonata? Why didn't you bring him back if you found him?" "He's with Animal Control," Mendoza said dryly. "He's part of the evidence in the murder case, so if you want to see your precious Stallion anytime soon, I suggest you cooperate with the investigation." Croft let out a strangled, desperate whine and pulled his cell phone from his pocket with shaking hands. Fine, just hold on," Croft practically begged, his thumbs flying clumsily across his phone screen. "Just give me 2 seconds. Let me text my assistant to loop the feed on the rest of the cameras or switch everything to the offline maintenance screen." "Loop the feed?" Mendoza raised an eyebrow. "How often do you do it around here?" Today was the first time when Midnight Sonata went missing I couldn't think of anything else. Croft didn't look up from his screen, aggressively mashing the send button. My personal assistant knows how to do this stuff, just give her a second to do it. Mr. Croft, Mendoza said, sizing him up, who exactly is this assistant? Croft finally looked up from his phone, hitting the button on his remote to unlock the heavy iron gates. The metal groaned as it began to slowly swing inward. Beatrice, Croft said, wiping a line of sweat from his cheek. Beatrice Mercado. Why? No reason. Rafa smiled, his aviators catching the glare of the flashing police lights. We would just love to talk to her. Chapter 7. The air conditioning inside the Vista Verde administrative office was cranked to a temperature that bordered on cryogenic. Everything was neutral white and steel. Harrison Croft leaned over the polished glass desk of his assistant, tapping a manicured finger against her computer monitor. I don't care about the firewall protocol, Beatrice, Croft hissed, entirely ignoring the 5 people who had just walked into the room. I need you to change all the feeds to the maintenance screen right now. If anyone sees police cruisers parked in front of our property, we are both going to lose our jobs. Beatrice Mercado kept her eyes glued to her keyboard. She was in her early 30s, wearing a crisp navy blouse, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun. Her hands shook slightly as they hovered over the keys. She shot a single, desperate glance toward Mendoza and slightly gestured with her eyes at Croft. Mendoza understood the hint and stepped closer to the table. Mr. Croft, you are interfering with an active police investigation. Step away from the desk. Croft spun around, his face flushed underneath his artificial tan. Detective, you don't understand the financial stakes of this facility. Officer Carter, Mendoza interrupted, not taking her eyes off Beatrice. Mr. Croft seems deeply concerned about the security of his estate. Why don't you escort him outside so he can show you where exactly the cameras are situated? Officer Carter is one of the best forensic digital specialists on the force, Alex said, nodding. I'm sure he can point all the blind spots you might have missed. Let's go for a walk, Mr. Croft, Lucien said, corralling him away. Consider it a free consultation. I'll accompany you and maybe give you some pointers. Reg landed a heavy hand on Croft's shoulder. I have more than 20 years in the U.S. Navy, you know. You can't buy that kind of expertise. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind them. Gary let out a long breath, pulling his Stetson off his head and wiping his forehead. I would pay actual money to watch Reg throw that guy into the ocean. Mendoza ignored the commentary and looked straight at Beatrice. You wanted to talk? Beatrice crumbled. The rigid, professional posture of the private assistant vanished in a fraction of a second. Beatrice covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a jagged, broken sob. Tears spilled over her eyelashes. Take a breath, Beatrice, Alex said gently, pulling a box of tissues from the corner of the desk and pressing them into the assistant's hands. You aren't in trouble. We just need to know what went wrong. Beatrice grabbed a handful of tissues, whipping her eyes. He was just supposed to take him for a joyride. That was it. It was just a stupid, ridiculous joke. Rafa tilted his head. Midnight Sonata? Yes, Beatrice choked out, wiping her cheeks. Nico and we've known each other since elementary school. We were barn kids. We grew up mucking stalls and riding bareback in the valley together. Mendoza pulled a notepad from her blazer pocket, clicking her pen. If you are so close to the Lavari family, why are you working for Harrison Croft? Croft hates the Lavaris. Because Stefan Lavari already employs 40 of his cousins and nephews, Beatrice explained, letting out a wet, humorless laugh. I wanted to work in the equestrian world, but I also wanted corporate wages and a 401k. Croft pays incredibly well. It wasn't a betrayal. Nico understood. He actually thought it was hilarious that I was taking a billionaire's money to sit in air conditioning. So you were the inside woman, Gary realized, jumping up from the white couch. Nico wanted to steal the Stallion, and you gave him the keys. He wasn't stealing it, Beatrice protested, her voice rising in defensive panic. She looked at Mendoza. I swear to God, detective, he wasn't keeping the horse. He was just going to take Midnight Sonata for a ride and bring him right back before sunrise. Shannon, who had quietly followed them into the office, furrowed her brow. Why? Croft said the horse is worth over $1 million. Why risk taking it out of a high-tech fortress just for a joyride? To humiliate Harrison, Beatrice said, balling the tissues in her fist. Harrison is a massive snob. He's racist, he's prejudiced, and he constantly calls Ironwood a gypsy scrapyard to the island zoning board. Nico finally had enough. He wanted to prove that Vista Verde's multi-million-dollar security system was a joke. A traditional horse theft, Rafa nodded, remembering Stefan Lavari's story. Nico was reviving the old custom to prove his prowess before the wedding. He wanted to show Croft that he could take his most prized possession without breaking a sweat. Yes, but Nico had to make it a spectacle, Beatrice sniffled, a tiny, watery smile breaking through her grief. He wasn't just going to return the horse. He was going to bring Midnight Sonata back wearing a giant, sparkly unicorn horn strapped to his forehead, with pink braids woven through his mane. Gary stared at her. His eyes went wide with absolute, unadulterated delight. A unicorn horn? And pink braids, Beatrice confirmed, wiping her nose. He wanted Harrison to walk into the pristine elite barn this morning and find his world-class, terrifying Hanoverian warm blood looking like a children's toy. Nico said Harrison would have a heart attack right there in the aisle. That is genuinely brilliant, Gary whispered in awe. I wish I had thought of that. Gary, Mendoza snapped sharply. Gary immediately closed his mouth and put his Stetson back on. Mendoza turned her attention back to Beatrice. So you looped the camera feeds? Beatrice nodded miserably. At midnight, I switched the main aisle cameras to the maintenance loop. I unlocked the side paddock door remotely. Nico was waiting in the brush. He slipped in, haltered the horse, and walked him up the service trail. I turned the cameras back on 5 minutes later. The night watchman was asleep in the guard shack. Nobody saw a thing. Nico texted me when he cleared the tree line. That was the last time I heard from him. Alex rubbed Beatrice's shoulder, her eyes scanning the young woman's frantic body language. Who else knew about this prank, Beatrice? If Nico texted you, who else was he texting? Everyone, Beatrice sobbed. Nico never kept a secret in his life. He was loud and arrogant, and he bragged about the unicorn idea to our entire group. Your group? Rafa asked. What group? The 5 of us, Beatrice explained, ticking them off on her fingers. Me and Nico. Then there's Toma Lavari. He's Nico's cousin, the head trainer at Ironwood. He does all the actual heavy lifting while Nico acts like the boss. And Ricardo Silva, he's the local farrier on the island. He shoes the horses for both Ironwood and Vista Verde. And the 5th? Alex asked softly. Roxana, Beatrice whispered, fresh tears spilling over her cheeks. The bride. Mendoza stopped writing. Nico told his bride he was going to steal $1 million horse the night before their wedding? Beatrice let out a broken sigh. Roxana isn't a delicate flower, detective. She is an elite, world-class Grand Prix showjumper. She is the best rider in the Caribbean. Everyone wants her to ride their horses. Rafa's eyes gleamed as a piece of the puzzle snapped into place. Everyone including Harrison Croft? Beatrice nodded. The owners practically threw a blank check at Roxana to get her to jump Midnight Sonata in the international circuit. She laughed in Harrison's face. She told him she only rides for her people. Harrison's ego couldn't handle the rejection. It's a huge part of why he hates the Lavaris so much. Beatrice. Mendoza tapped her pen against her notepad. Did Nico have any enemies? Was anyone in that group angry with him? Angry enough to follow him up that trail? Beatrice shook her head violently. No, I know how it sounds. Nico was an exhausting prankster. He drove us all crazy. He was arrogant and he never knew when to quit. But he had a good heart. He would give you the shirt off his back. We are a family. None of them would ever want to hurt him. Someone did hurt him, Rafa said gently. Someone met him in that clearing. And judging by the bruised knuckles on his right hand, Nico fought back before he was killed. The reality of the violent death seemed to finally crash over Beatrice all at once. She looked down at the expensive smartphone sitting on her desk. "I have to call her," Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling. "I have to call Roxana, but what do I even say to her?" Alex squeezed Beatrice's shoulder. "Tell her you're sorry and you're there for her." Chapter 8. The joyful, chaotic energy that had surrounded the Ironwood estate only an hour ago was entirely gone. As they walked toward the massive wooden barns, the silence on the property felt heavy and sad. The caterers were quietly breaking down the buffets, loading crates of uneaten food into the back of idling box trucks. The string quartet had packed up their instruments and vanished. "This is depressing," Gary muttered, keeping his voice uncharacteristically low. "The family will be in the main house with Stefan," Rafa said, taking in the surroundings. "But if Beatrice was right about the friend group, the barn kids will be where they feel most in control." Rafa was right. Standing halfway down the pristine center aisle of the barn, bathed in the dusty golden light filtering through the skylights, was Roxana. She wore a stunning, fitted white silk dress, but the elegant fabric was violently contrasted by the dirt-scuffed leather riding boots on her feet. Her bridal makeup was heavily smudged around her dark eyes, leaving jagged tracks of ruined mascara down her cheeks. She held a stiff, bristled dandy brush in her hand, aggressively sweeping it in long, furious strokes over the coat of a massive bay gelding. Two men hovered around her. As soon as they got closer to the stall, one of them turned. "Uncle Stefan said the police were coming," Toma said, his voice a low, warning rumble. "My cousin is dead. Rox doesn't need to answer your questions today." "I am very sorry for your loss, Toma," Mendoza said, stopping a respectful distance away. "But the first 48 hours of an investigation dictate whether we catch the person who did this. Beatrice told us about the prank." Roxana stopped brushing the horse. "The unicorn horn," Roxana whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. She tossed the dandy brush into a plastic grooming tote on the floor. "Nico thought it was the funniest thing in the world." Alex stepped forward. "Beatrice told us he bragged about it to all of you. Did you try to stop him?" "Of course I tried to stop him," Roxana choked out, stepping around Toma to face Alex. "But not because I was mad at him. I loved him. I loved his stupid jokes. I told him not to do it because Harrison Croft is an arrogant, prejudiced idiot who wouldn't understand the historical lesson Nico was trying to teach him. I told Nico that Croft would just call the police and ruin our wedding day." Roxana let out a wet, bitter laugh, wiping a streak of ruined mascara from her cheek with the back of a dirty hand. "I thought the worst thing that could happen was Nico getting arrested in his tuxedo." "Did Nico have enemies?" Reg asked, leaning at the stall gate. "Someone on the island who hated the pranks enough to take it too far?" Toma's jaw clenched tight enough to crack a tooth. "You think someone killed him over a prank?" "People have been killed for much less, Mr. Lavari," Rafa said. "Nico wasn't just a prankster," Ricardo finally spoke up, pushing off the stall wall. "I know how Beatrice makes him sound. He was exhausting, but you don't build an empire by just telling jokes." Toma nodded fiercely, stepping up beside Ricardo. "Stefan is a good man. He gave us this foundation, but Stefan has always had a second-class mindset. He thought we were lucky just to have a piece of the valley. He never believed a Romani farm could compete with the international barns. Nico refused to accept that." Roxana crossed her arms over her white dress. "Nico was the one who actually got out of the saddle and sat behind the desk. He went to the States. He got an MBA. He spent years visiting the most elite breeding barns in the world, learning their infrastructure, their corporate networking, their business models. He came back and weaponized it," Toma finished, his chest heaving with a deep, protective pride. "Nico was the visionary. He modernized Ironwood. He negotiated the international transport contracts. In 5 years, he turned this farm from a local breeding operation into a global powerhouse. He was the only one willing to sit in an office and force the island's elite to look us in the eye. That's why Croft hated him. Not because of the jokes, because Nico was stealing their market share." "I understand," Mendoza said, holding Toma's furious gaze. Nico was the engine, which means his death benefits your competitors. But I still need to establish a timeline. Where were all of you last night at midnight? Ricardo crossed his heavy arms over his leather apron. We work on a horse farm, detective. We are up at 4 in the morning to feed and muck stalls. We were all in our own beds by 9 o'clock. All of you? Mendoza pressed. All of us, Toma confirmed, his tone daring her to challenge him. That's going to be a problem, Reg stated flatly, because whoever met Nico in that clearing last night didn't hike up the service trail. Roxana's brow furrowed. What do you mean? I mean Nico walked Midnight Sonata up the ridge on foot, Reg explained, his eyes locking onto Toma. But the killer didn't walk. I found the tracks in the mud. The person who killed Nico rode a horse up to that clearing, fought him, and rode away. One of the horses in the back stalls let out a soft snort, kicking a wooden board. Mendoza looked directly at Toma. If you were all in bed, Mr. Lavari, I highly suggest you do a head count of your stables, because someone saddled a horse in the dark last night. Toma stared at the detective, completely blindsided. The fierce, defensive anger melted into absolute shock. A second horse? Do you have a picture of those second tracks? Ricardo suddenly asked. We do, Mendoza said, looking confused. Why do you want to see it? Because, Ricardo said, fishing an unpolished horseshoe out of his pocket. Every farrier has a signature. He flipped the shoe over, pointing a calloused, grease-stained finger at the angled edges of the steel. It's how we shape the toe. It's the exact angle of the nail holes. It's the type of traction studs we use for the San Malvino mud. I forge custom shoes for every single horse on this property. And I am contracted to shoe every single horse at Vista Verde. Reg raised an eyebrow. You can identify the horse by the print? If it stepped in deep mud, yes, Ricardo promised, gripping the horseshoe tightly. I know my own work. Show me a picture of the tracks you found in that clearing. I can tell you exactly whose horse the killer was riding. Officer Carter. Mendoza turned to Lucien, who was currently petting a huge bay stallion with Shannon and Gary. Leave the poor horse alone and pull up the high-res photos from the crime scene. Lucien fumbled with his tablet, his fingers flying across the screen. Right, pulling up the mud prints, enhancing contrast to highlight the depth strikes. Okay, got it. For 10 long, agonizing seconds, the farrier just stared at the glowing screen. Detective, he said finally. Those aren't mine. Chapter 9. I'm just saying, Shannon announced, dropping into one of the delicate, gold-rimmed Chiavari chairs in one of the tents. I woke up this morning completely oblivious to the fact that San Malvino even had a horse population. I thought the island's entire animal demographic consisted of dogs, cats, and that one pelican syndicate by the fish market. Now suddenly, we have million-dollar showjumpers, rival barns, and a rogue killer on horseback. Gary nodded vigorously, chewing on a bacon-wrapped scallop the caterers forgot to pack, and tossed a second one to Bombay, who caught it mid-air. Stop feeding my dog high-end appetizers, Reg said, shaking his head. He'll refuse to eat kibble, and my pension is not big enough to cover that level of sophistication. He found the horse, didn't he? Gary argued, loading a small ceramic plate with miniature beef Wellingtons. He deserves a treat. Rafa pulled a cold bottle of water from a galvanized tub of ice near the table and took a sip. So, Ricardo the farrier says the killer's horse wasn't wearing his shoes, which means it wasn't a Vista Verde horse and it wasn't an Ironwood horse. Where else do you even get a horse on this rock? Lucien slid into the chair next to Shannon, holding his tablet like a shield against the tropical sun creeping under the canvas edge. I checked the San Malvino Department of Agriculture database while we were walking back from the barn. You'd be surprised. There are exactly 342 registered equines on the island. Mendoza rolled up her sleeves and sat down next to him. 300? Doing what? A little bit of everything, Lucien read off the screen. There are 4 massive fruit plantations that use draft horses to haul carts, I guess. There are 3 different tourist traps offering sunset beach rides. There's a petting zoo near the commercial docks. which should be banned, and about 80 private citizens who just own a horse or two. But how did a beach pony get all the way up to the North Ridge clearing at midnight? Reg asked. That place is dark, muddy, and basically in the middle of the jungle. The killer had a trained horse and knew how to handle it. And they knew exactly where Nico was going to be, Rafa added. I doubt someone was coincidentally riding their horse in that place. That is the detail that bothers me the most, Mendoza said, looking through her notebook. Everyone knew Nico was a prankster. But who knew his exact itinerary? Beatrice knew, Alex said, leaning her elbows on the linen table. She gave him the 5-minute window to bypass the cameras at midnight, and she said Nico texted the group chat the second he cleared the tree line. So the suspect pool is the group chat, Shannon concluded, taking a pull from her water bottle. Toma, Ricardo, Roxana, and Beatrice. But Ricardo looked at the shoe print and said it wasn't his work, Lucienne said. If one of the friends rode up there to kill Nico, they would have been riding an ironwood horse. And Ricardo shoes all the ironwood horses, so either Ricardo is lying to protect himself, or it really was someone from the outside. Or someone in the friend group used a burner horse, Gary suggested around a mouthful of pastry. Mendoza shot him a look. A burner horse? You know, like a burner phone, Gary explained casually, waving a miniature beef Wellington in the air. You buy a cheap, untraceable horse from a tourist trap, you ride it up the mountain, commit a murder, and then you let it go in the woods so it doesn't trace back to you. Lucien stared at Gary in horror. You can't just throw away a horse, Gary. It's a living dinosaur. Gary's terminology is absurd, but the tactical logic is sound, Reg admitted begrudgingly. If Ricardo is telling the truth about the shoe print, the killer deliberately brought an outside animal up to that ridge, which means this wasn't a crime of passion or a sudden argument that got out of hand. It was premeditated. But why a fist fight? Alex mused, her eyes tracing the woven pattern of the tablecloth. Think about the violence, Angela. If this was a premeditated assassination, you wait in the brush, you shoot him, and you ride away. A fistfight is intimate. It implies a conversation, an argument. Nico had time to recognize the threat, drop the lead rope, and throw a punch. Maybe the killer didn't plan to kill him, Rafa suggested. Maybe they just rode up there to confront him, to tell him the prank was stupid, and Nico got arrogant and threw the first punch. Or maybe he wasn't doing a prank, Mendoza said, her voice dropping into a hard, cynical register. She tapped her pen against her notepad. We are taking the word of his grieving friends that this was just a harmless joke with a unicorn horn. What if Croft was actually right all along? What if Nico really was stealing the stallion to sell it on the black market, and the killer was a buyer who double-crossed him? No, Rafa said instantly, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for debate. Mendoza raised an eyebrow. You're ruling it out completely? Angie, look around you. Rafa gestured broadly to the sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate, the massive white tents, the rows of barns in the distance. Nico Lovari was not a street thug desperate for cash. He had a master's degree in business administration. He spent the last 5 years building an international corporate empire. You do not build this level of legitimate wealth by committing a felony that would permanently void your reputation. Rafa is right, Alex agreed. Nico was a proud, arrogant visionary who was deeply insulted by Croft's racism. He didn't want the horse's financial value. He wanted Croft's humiliation. The prank was real. Gary swallowed the last bite of his Wellington and wiped his hands on a linen napkin. He stared at the empty chafing dish, his brow furrowing in deep, uncharacteristic concentration. Okay, Gary said slowly, if the prank was real, where is the unicorn horn? The banter under the tent came to an abrupt, screeching halt. Gary blinked, suddenly hyper-aware of the silence. What? Did I say something wrong? Say that again, Gary, Mendoza said, stepping closer to him. I just meant... Gary gestured vaguely toward the mountain ridge. Beatrice said Nico was going to dress Midnight Sonata up like a children's toy to give Croft a heart attack. He supposedly bought a giant sparkly unicorn horn and a bunch of neon pink mane braids off the internet, right? Right, Alex confirmed, her eyes widening slightly as she saw exactly where Gary was going. Well, he had to take them with him, Gary pointed out, holding up a finger for emphasis. You can't dress a horse up if you leave the costume at home. So Nico had the horn and the braids on him when he went up that trail, but when we found the horse, he was just a regular horse. He was wearing a standard leather halter and a lead rope, Reg confirmed, his voice dropping an octave. Exactly, Gary said, spreading his hands. The horse wasn't wearing the horn, and the horn wasn't lying in the grass next to the body, and Mendoza checked his pockets, and they were empty. Rafa lowered his water bottle. A sharp, dangerous smile spread across his face. The killer took them. Why would a killer stop to pick up a novelty costume piece after caving a man's skull in? Mendoza asked, walking back and forth in the tent. Because of the fist fight, Reg said, pointing a finger. Alex is right. It was a close quarters struggle. If Nico fought back, things got chaotic. Maybe the killer bled on the horn or grabbed it. Either way, they touched them. Fingerprints, Lucien gasped, tapping his tablet excitedly. Or touch DNA, or blood spatter. If the killer left the props at the scene, we could pull a full genetic profile off the plastic. Or, Alex added quietly, the psychological trap closing in her mind. Nico didn't buy the props at all. Beatrice said Nico bragged about the prank on the group chat. What if the killer bought the horn and the braids, brought them up to the ridge, and used them to lure Nico into a false sense of security before the fight started? If the killer bought them, Rafa murmured, then the purchase history traces directly back to their credit card. Either way, the killer couldn't risk leaving them behind. They gathered up the unicorn horn and the braids, got back on their horse, and rode away. Mendoza let out a sharp, genuine laugh of disbelief. She looked at Gary, shaking her head. Gary, I can't believe I am saying this, but that was an incredibly brilliant deduction. Gary puffed his chest out, adjusting his Stetson proudly. Thank you, Detective. I find that high-quality beef really stimulates my gray matter. All right, Mendoza said, looking around the tent. We have a killer on a rogue horse with a signature shoe print and missing prank props. Let's find them. Chapter 10. I am sorry to bother you, Mendoza said, walking back into the barn. But where would Nico buy a unicorn horn and pink braids for his prank? Toma let out a rough, exhausted laugh and pushed off the barn wall, shaking his head. Nico didn't buy them, he said, his voice thick with a mix of grief and bitter amusement. He didn't have time for that. He just raided the Ironwood employee daycare. Shannon looked at him in surprise. You guys have an employee daycare? It was Nico's idea, Ricardo chimed in, adjusting the heavy leather strap of his farrier's apron. A couple of years ago, the farm was losing thousands of dollars a month paying out sick leave because the staff had to stay home whenever their kids didn't have childcare, and usually both parents work here. Nico ran the numbers. He realized it was cheaper to build a playground and hire a teacher than to keep covering the absent labor. Toma continued, I'm telling you, he may have been a terrible prankster, but he was a visionary. That is a ruthlessly efficient piece of corporate management, Rafa said. That was Nico. Toma nodded, looking down at his calloused hands. He built a fenced-in paddock behind the lower pastures, ordered a bunch of plastic slides, and threw in a couple of retired fat ponies so the kids could learn to groom them. And to keep the in-laws happy, he put Roxana's older sister in charge. Mendoza pulled her notepad back out. Roxana has a sister? Is she up at the main house with the bride? Toma and Ricardo exchanged a heavy, loaded look. I doubt it. Zora doesn't really do family crises, Toma explained carefully, choosing his words. She has always been a bit kooky, even when we were kids. She's only 3 years older than us, but she never hung out with us at the barns. She's different. She's a traditionalist, Ricardo said, crossing his massive arms over his chest. She wears the old woven skirts. She tells the kids the old folklore, and she refuses to use a smartphone. She was furious when Nico went to America for his MBA. She told him he was selling the Roma soul to the corporate America, so Nico gave her the daycare to run so she could teach the employee kids about Roma culture. Her sister's wedding was just canceled because the groom was murdered, and she didn't go to comfort her? Reg raised a brow. No, Toma said flatly. I saw her walking toward the lower pastures an hour ago. She said the kids needed their routine. She takes her work very seriously. Mendoza snapped her notepad shut. Where is this daycare? The Ironwood employee daycare was located a quarter-mile down a sloping gravel path, completely hidden from the show-jumping barns by a thick grove of ancient oak trees. It was a wide, grassy paddock enclosed by white vinyl fencing that was currently covered in chaotic smears of blue and green finger paint. A cluster of plastic slides and brightly colored playhouses sat in the center of the grass. Tied to the fence were 3 of the fattest, fluffiest Shetland ponies and a very old, massive mare. A group of toddlers aggressively brushed their manes with plastic combs. Well, this is adorable, Gary said, stepping through the swinging gate. A toddler with a face entirely covered in graham cracker crumbs immediately waddled over, grabbed a fistful of Gary's pearl-snap denim shirt, and wiped his sticky hands completely down the fabric. Okay, less adorable, Gary muttered, prying the kid's fingers off his shirt. Mendoza ignored the chaos, her eyes sweeping the paddock until she found their target. Zora Rostas was standing near a low plastic picnic table, violently scrubbing the surface with a wet rag. Toma had not exaggerated her traditionalism. In stark contrast to her sister Roxana's modern wedding dress, Zora wore a heavy, ankle-length woven skirt in deep reds and golds, paired with a long-sleeved, high-necked blouse. In the suffocating midday tropical humidity, it looked entirely unbearable, but Zora wasn't even breaking a sweat. Mendoza approached the picnic table, holding up her gold shield. Zora Rostas? I am Detective Mendoza with the San Malvino police. I need to speak with you. Zora did not stop scrubbing the table. She didn't look up at the badge. I am working, Detective. The children require supervision. We know this is a terrible day for your family, Zora. We just spoke with Roxana in the barn. She is incredibly devastated, Alex said, stepping beside Mendoza, adopting her softest, most empathetic tone. Zora's scrubbing hand froze for a fraction of a second. Roxana is strong. Zora resumed scrubbing. She will survive. She always does. Now, if you do not mind, it is almost time for snacks. Mendoza dropped the gentle approach. We aren't here for a wellness check, Zora. We are here about Nico. Toma and Ricardo told us that Nico came down to this daycare recently and took a few items from your toy chests, a sparkly unicorn horn and some neon pink mane braids. Zora's hand stopped moving completely. She pressed the wet rag flat against the plastic table. Nico took many things that did not belong to him, Zora said, still looking at the table. I do not keep track of his foolishness. So you didn't see him take the horn? Mendoza pressed, stepping closer. No, Zora stated. Can you check the inventory? Rafa asked, wandering over to a massive, brightly colored plastic toy bin overflowing with jump ropes, plastic swords, and stuffed animals. He started digging through it, tossing a rubber chicken over his shoulder. Maybe he returned it, or maybe he never actually took it in the first place. I do not keep an inventory of toys, Zora snapped, finally looking up. The children lose things every day. They leave them in the grass, the ponies step on them, they bury them in the sandbox. We just buy new ones. Now, if you excuse me, the children need me. She threw the wet rag onto the table and speed-walked across the grass, scooping up one of the kids and pointedly turned her back to Mendoza, making it explicitly clear the interview was over. Chapter 11. I smell like stale apple juice and peanut butter, Gary complained, holding the damp fabric away from his chest, while they walked back up the sloping gravel path. I'm wearing a Western shirt. It's supposed to smell like mesquite wood and danger, not a toddler's lunch. It's a daycare, Gary, not a day spa, Shannon pointed out, stepping carefully over a massive, muddy tractor rut. Besides, considering you basically ate half the catering budget under that wedding tent, smelling like a snack is incredibly fitting. Bombay, walking obediently at Reg's heel, let out a soft, hopeful whine and actively tried to sniff Gary's pocket. Reg gave the nylon leash a gentle tug. "Leave it, Bombay. Gary is not a food group." Mendoza ignored the chaos behind her and walked ahead toward Alex. "Talk to me. What are you thinking?" "I am thinking she was too cold," Alex said, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. Her baseline behavior was completely detached. When we told her Roxana was devastated, Zora didn't flinch. She didn't offer a word of sympathy for her sister's ruined wedding, and she certainly didn't shed a tear for her murdered brother-in-law. "She gripped that wet rag like she was trying to strangle it," Rafa nodded, keeping pace with Mendoza. "I think she kind of hated Nico. That much was obvious." "But I don't think she killed him," Alex said, giving it a thought. "She's a traditionalist running a daycare. She doesn't have the strength to ambush a grown man and engage in a brutal, knuckle-splitting fistfight." "No, but she definitely knows who did," Mendoza said, stopping at the edge of the shade, and turned around. "Lucian, do a deep dive on Zora Rostas. I want to know exactly who she is outside of that daycare." "Ironwood has free Wi-Fi. Neat," Lucian said, typing furiously on his tablet. "I'm already in the public records database. Give me a second." "Hurry up," Gary urged, peering over Lucian's shoulder. "I want to know if she has a secret criminal empire." "She's a daycare teacher, Gary, not a cartel boss," Shannon sighed. "Okay, got her," Lucian announced, stopping in the middle of the gravel path. "Zora Rostas. She's 35 years old, no criminal record. She married a man named Iancu Rostas exactly 12 years ago." Mendoza leaned closer to the screen. "Children?" "None on record." Lucian shook his head, his finger swiping down the glowing screen. "And their financial history is a complete mess. They bounce around a lot. Credit card debt, missed rent payments. Looks like neither of them can hold down a job for more than a year. Zora was making custom-woven blankets for a while, and Iancu did odd jobs. Construction, landscaping, a stint on a fishing boat." "What about Ironwood?" Rafa prompted. "How come he doesn't work here?" "He used to," Lucian said, tapping another window. "Looks like Stefan Lavari put both of them on the Ironwood payroll about 3 years ago. Zora runs the daycare, but Iancu's employment was terminated 8 months ago." Alex crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Stefan fired his own relative? In a family this tight-knit, you have to do something pretty egregious to get fired from the family business." "Maybe he stole a horse," Gary whispered loudly. "Gary, don't turn into Croft," Reg gave him a side-eye. "Wait!" Lucian gasped, his eyes going wide. "Boss, you have to see this!" The entire group clustered around Lucian in the middle of the gravel path. "What is it, Lucian?" Mendoza asked. "Iancu Rostas does have a criminal record," Lucian breathed out, pointing a shaking finger at a digitized San Malvino police report from over a decade ago. 12.5 years ago, to be exact, he was arrested on the south shore of the island. "For what?" Shannon asked, leaning in. "Grand theft equine," Lucian read, looking up at the group. "He was arrested for stealing a horse." "Told you so," Gary yelped triumphantly. 12 years ago, Rafa murmured, doing the math. "Right before he married Zora." Mendoza didn't waste another second. "Come on, let's go have a chat with the boss." They found Stefan Lavari sitting in his office, staring blankly at the silver equestrian trophies lining the walls. "Did you arrest Croft?" he asked as soon as they entered. "We spoke to Croft," Mendoza answered, stopping in the center of the woven rug. "There's no evidence proving that he's the murderer. What can you tell us about Iancu Rostas?" "Iancu," Stefan murmured, shaking his head. "Iancu is a fool. But why do you care about Zora's husband?" "We care because we ran a background check on him," Mendoza said, taking the tablet from Lucian. "And it turns out he has a very interesting employment history. Why did you fire him 8 months ago?" Stefan leaned back in his leather chair. Because he is a liability. Iancu is old blood. He is a man born a century too late. He thinks with his fists, not his brain. Likes to throw punches? Rafa asked, locking on to the patriarch. Especially after a couple of drinks, Stefan said bitterly. If someone looks at him wrong at a bar, he throws a punch. If a delivery driver cuts him off, he throws a punch. I tried to give him a chance. I gave him a job in the lower barns, mucking stalls and fixing fences. But he refused to adapt. He hated the showjumpers. He hated the corporate clients. He got into a screaming match with one of our biggest international investors because the man didn't know how to properly hold a lead rope. I couldn't have him on the property anymore. I had a business to protect. A business Nico built, Alex said softly. Stefan nodded miserably. Yes. Nico demanded I fire him and gave Zora the daycare instead. He was right. Iancu was bad for Ironwood. Mendoza took a step closer to the desk. We also pulled Iancu's arrest record, Mr. Lavari. 12 years ago, he was arrested for stealing a horse. Stefan actually let out a dry, nostalgic laugh. Stealing a horse, Stefan repeated, picking up a crystal decanter and pouring some whiskey into a tumbler. You make him sound like a master thief, detective. He was an idiot in love. Gary leaned forward, entirely captivated. So he really did the old tradition thing? He stole a horse for Zora? Zora demanded it, Stefan explained, taking a slow sip of his drink. She has always been obsessed with the old ways. She told Iancu she would not marry him unless he proved his worth the way our ancestors did. She wanted him to steal a prized animal and present it to her. And did he? Shannon asked. He tried, Stefan snorted, a brief flash of dark humor breaking through his grief. He drank half a bottle of plum brandy for courage, walked down to the Sunset Beach Hotel on the South Shore, and untied a 20-year-old half-blind trail pony from a wooden fence. The pony didn't even want to walk. Iancu was pulling it down the sidewalk when the police got to him. He didn't even make it 2 blocks. Gary clamped a hand over his mouth to muffle a laugh. Lucien stared at the ceiling, shaking his head at the absolute absurdity of the crime. It was embarrassing, Stefan admitted, resting his elbows on the desk. The charges were dropped to a misdemeanor, of course, because the pony was safely returned to the hotel. But in our culture, in our family, to fail at the one romantic, daring tradition, it is a permanent stain on a man's pride. Reg exchanged a look with Rafa. Did people still tease him about it, Stefan? Alex asked quietly. After 12 years, did the family still bring it up? Did they laugh at him? We all joked about it, Stefan chuckled. Alex didn't blink. And Nico? Especially Nico. Nico never let him live it down. Chapter 12. The mahogany-paneled walls of Stefan Lavari's office seemed to absorb the suffocating tension in the room. Lucien sat in one of the distressed leather armchairs, his glowing tablet balanced on his knees. His fingers flew across the screen with frantic precision. Everyone else stood in a tight semicircle around him, watching the text on the black screen. I have his phone number from the Ironwood Employee Registry, Lucien announced. Pinging the GPS towers now. The island's infrastructure is a disaster, but there, got it. Lucien tapped the screen, bringing up a digitized topographical map of San Malvino. A pulsing red dot sat directly over the dark green contours of the North Ridge. Midnight last night, Lucien confirmed, looking up at Mendoza. Iancu Rostas was standing less than 50 feet from where we found Nico. Mendoza let out a breath through her nose. That's enough for a warrant. I'll wake up the duty judge and get a subpoena for his carrier communications. I want to know exactly what Nico said to him to get him up that mountain. Hold on, Lucien interrupted, holding up a hand. He swiped rapidly through a cascading wall of green text on his screen. Don't bother the judge. Iancu doesn't use a modern smartphone. He's running a legacy operating system on a 12-year-old BlackBerry. Gary leaned over the back of Lucien's chair, genuinely baffled. They still make BlackBerries? With the little plastic keyboards? They don't, Lucien said, his fingers flying faster. which means he's operating on an outdated 3G network using unencrypted old-school SMS text messages. It's essentially broadcasting his texts in plain text to the local cell tower, bypassing the carrier entirely in 3, 2, 1. A long thread of text messages suddenly populated the center of the tablet. "Bingo!" Lucien grinned, proud of himself. Mendoza leaned over the screen, reading the bright white text bubbles sent from Nico Lavari's phone to Iancu's number at 11:30 the previous night. "I'm doing it," Mendoza read aloud. "The old tradition. I'm stealing a horse for Roxana tonight. Bring the unicorn horn and the braids from the daycare to the North Ridge clearing at midnight to make the beast pretty for her. I need a real horseman to help me handle it." Stefan closed his eyes, let out a heavy sigh, and shook his head. "He played him," Alex murmured. Nico knew Iancu's biggest humiliation was failing that exact tradition. So Nico told Iancu he was going to succeed where Iancu failed, and he stroked his ego just enough, calling him a real horseman, to trick Iancu into delivering the plastic props. He dragged Iancu up a mountain in the pitch black just to laugh in his face and use him as a delivery boy. He made Iancu the punchline of the family joke all over again, Rafa said. "And Iancu brought a heavy steel horseshoe up that mountain just in case he didn't find it funny?" Reg asked, rolling his eyes. "Iancu carries a horseshoe for good luck at all times," Stefan said from behind the desk. "I can't believe he actually killed my son." "So, what's next, boss?" Lucien asked, looking up from his tablet. "You want me to send uniforms to his address?" "No," Mendoza said instantly, holding up a hand to stop the momentum. She paced a slow line across the woven rug. "Iancu is old blood. He is an islander who drinks in dive bars, fights for fun, and knows every inch of this jungle. If he hears police sirens coming up his driveway, he'll vanish into the brush. We will be hunting him for 6 months." "Then we go quiet," Reg offered. "Rafa and I can bag him at the grocery store." "We also have a Zora problem," Mendoza pointed out, tapping a finger against her chin. "Zora was at that clearing. She knows exactly what her husband did, and she lied to my face. But I can't place her at the scene because she claims she doesn't own a smartphone, so we don't have her GPS. If I arrest Iancu now, Zora will lawyer up, deny everything, and play the innocent daycare teacher." Shannon shifted uncomfortably near the door. "So how do we catch her? If she won't talk and she doesn't have a phone, she's a ghost." Mendoza stopped pacing. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto the grieving father sitting behind the desk. "She isn't a ghost," Mendoza stated quietly. "She's a loyalist, and Iancu is desperate for validation. We don't go to them. We make them come to us, but we need the final boss to do it." Stefan opened his eyes, meeting the detective's unyielding gaze, and reached across the desk for his cell phone. "Tell me what to say." 2 minutes later, Stefan pressed the speaker button on his phone and set it flat on the polished mahogany. The line rang twice before a gruff, heavily guarded voice answered. "Stefan?" Iancu answered. He sounded tense, the background noise full of wind and passing cars. Stefan let out a long, ragged sigh, playing the part of a broken, desperate father with terrifying perfection. "Iancu, where are you?" "I am on the South Road," Iancu answered cautiously. "We heard the police sirens. Zora said there was an accident with Nico." "It was no accident," Stefan choked out, letting a perfectly timed crack of emotion slip into his baritone voice. "He is gone, Iancu. My boy is gone." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. "I am sorry, Stefan. Truly." "I need you here," Stefan said, leaning over the phone. "The police are tearing my farm apart. The caterers are fleeing. My family is falling apart and Toma is overwhelmed with the horses. I need old blood, Iancu. I need a real man to secure the gates and protect this family today." "You fired me, Stefan," Iancu reminded him, though the defensive anger in his voice was already melting into eager pride. "I was a fool," Stefan shouted, slamming a fist onto his desk. "I let Nico's corporate spreadsheets blind me. He pushed the family away, and look what happened to him. Iancu, I forgive you. All of it is forgiven. Please, come back to Ironwood. Take your old job back. I need you to lead the security for his funeral. I will be there in 10 minutes, Stefan, Iancu promised, trying to sound tough. I will handle the police. Do not worry. The line clicked dead. That was incredibly brave, Mr. Lavari, Alex said softly. Exactly 4 minutes later, heavy footsteps echoed rapidly down the tiled hallway outside the office. The heavy oak doors burst open. Zora practically ran into the room. The cold, unyielding detachment she had shown at the daycare was completely gone. Her cheeks were flushed, her chest heaving under her high-necked blouse, and her dark eyes were shining with a profound, triumphant relief. She completely ignored the people standing around the room, her gaze locking onto Stefan. "Stefan!" Zora gasped, pressing her hands to her chest. "Stefan, thank you. Thank you for forgiving him. Iancu will not let you down this time, I swear it." Mendoza stepped in front of the desk, cutting off Zora's path to the patriarch. "That is wonderful news, Zora," she said. "But how did you know he got his job back? He's in his truck on the South Road." Zora froze. The triumphant relief instantly shattered, replaced by a spike of raw panic. He called me," Zora stammered, taking a jerky step backward toward the heavy oak doors. "He called the daycare to tell me." Mendoza tilted her head. "He called the daycare?" "Yes." Zora nodded aggressively, clinging to the lie. "On the landline." "The daycare is a plastic slide in the middle of a grassy paddock, Zora," Mendoza said, walking toward her. "It doesn't have walls. It certainly does not have a landline. Hand over the phone." Zora's breathing hitched. "I do not own a phone. I reject." "Don't you dare lie in this office!" Stefan roared, surging to his feet. "Give the detective your phone, Zora!" Zora flinched as if she had been physically struck. Her hands shook violently as she reached deep into the heavy woven pocket of her traditional skirt. She pulled out a sleek, modern smartphone in a cheap plastic case and handed it to Mendoza. Mendoza didn't even look at the screen and passed it backward to Lucien. "GPS history confirms," Lucien announced quietly. "This device was at the Northridge clearing at exactly midnight last night." Zora let out a jagged, broken sob, covering her face with her hands. She crumpled against the door frame, sliding slowly down to the floor in a pile of heavy woven fabric. "I tried to stop him," Zora cried into her hands, the truth finally spilling out in a wave of devastating guilt. Nico laughed at him. He stood in the clearing holding that stupid plastic horn, and he laughed at Iancu. He told him that only a drunken fool would ride through the jungle at midnight to deliver a unicorn horn. Iancu just snapped. "I'm so sorry, Stefan." "And you took the horn and the braids to hide the evidence," Rafa concluded, looking down at the crying woman with zero sympathy. "Iancu touched them," Zora wept. "I had to protect my husband." Before anyone could say another word, the sound of heavy, confident footsteps echoed down the hallway. The remaining half of the heavy oak door swung open wide. Iancu Rostas strutted into the office. He was a broad, thickly built man wearing faded jeans and a grease-stained t-shirt. "Stefan, what is this?" he asked, noticing his wife sobbing on the floor. Mendoza unclipped the handcuffs from her belt and stepped forward. "Iancu Rostas, you are under arrest." Chapter 13. "I am just saying, Gary, there is a time and a place to accept a gift," Shannon said, holding the wooden garden gate open. "And the immediate aftermath of a family tragedy is usually not it." Gary waddled through the gate, his vision completely obscured by a towering, precarious stack of aluminum catering trays and plastic takeout containers. "I didn't ask for it," Gary protested, his voice muffled behind a tray of roasted plantains. "Stefan specifically ordered his kitchen staff to pack all the untouched wedding food for us as a thank you. Do you know how rude it is to say no to a grieving father?" "You looked very eager for a guy who was just trying to be polite," Alex noted, walking in behind them with 2 bottles of wine. "It's about cultural sensitivity, Alex," Gary argued, dropping the massive stack of food onto the porch table with a heavy metallic clatter. For all we know, it is a deeply rooted Roma tradition to gift food to the people who solve your family crises. If I had said no, Stefan might have been deeply offended. I basically saved face for all of you. You are a hero, Gary, Reg said dryly, handing Alex a corkscrew, and reached for one of the aluminum trays. Bombay trotted next to Gary and sat at his feet, completely ignoring Reg and Alex. Traitor, Reg said to the dog and turned to Rafa. Speaking of saving face, do you think Croft is going to ask for his retainer back? You technically found his horse, but Midnight Sonata is still locked in an animal control holding paddock as evidence. I don't know, Rafa chuckled. I suppose he could try to invoice me, but demanding a refund after your racist assumptions completely blew up in your face would be incredibly cheap behavior for such an esteemed gentleman. In my experience, Reg said, loading a plate with beef and potatoes, the esteemed gentlemen are usually the cheapest people on the planet. He doesn't have the nerve to call you anyway, Shannon said, grabbing a fork. He is currently too busy trying to explain to his billionaire boss in Monaco why the San Malvino police raided his pristine barn. Speaking of horses, Lucien spoke up from the porch stairs. Why doesn't the San Malvino Police Department have horse cops? Every major city has mounted units. It's excellent for crowd control. Mendoza took a slow sip of her beer, leveling a deeply exhausted stare at her IT specialist. Lucien, this island's police department relies on exactly one homicide detective to investigate every single murder that happens here, Mendoza said flatly. We can barely afford printer toner. We definitely don't have the budget to board, feed, and vet a tactical cavalry unit. Alex smiled, pouring a splash of red wine into her glass. Why the sudden interest in mounted units, Lucien? Are you looking to change your specialty? Finally step out of the server closet and become a beat cop on horseback? Not a chance! Lucien shuddered visibly at the thought of patrolling outdoors. But you have to admit, it would be mighty fancy to ride a horse to work every morning. You wouldn't even have to look for parking. You just tie it to a meter. The entire porch erupted into laughter. Lucien, you spent the entire morning hiding behind a tree because you were convinced Midnight Sonata was a bloodthirsty dinosaur, Gary pointed out through a mouthful of plantains. I still think they are dinosaurs, Lucien defended himself, adjusting his glasses. But I've been analyzing their behavior. They don't speak, they hate loud noises, and they just want to stand in a quiet corner and eat snacks. They are animal introverts. I respect that. I think I would like to befriend one. If you want to befriend a horse, you can start by mucking out stalls, Rafa smiled, raising his bottle of water. I hear Ironwood Equine has an open position in their security and maintenance department. I think I'll stick to the server room, Lucien muttered, picking up a plate. Reg chuckled, raising his beer bottle toward the group. To Lucien's future cavalry career, Reg toasted, his eyes crinkling with amusement, and to Gary, for single-handedly saving our cultural relations by stealing a grieving family's buffet. What can I say? Gary said, grabbing another beef pastry. I'm a diplomat. This has been Death by Stolen Stallion, a hilarious feel-good cozy mystery. Book 34 in the Island Whodunit series, written by Tess Marlowe.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next mystery. See you on San Malvino.